I have a fistful of questions here, so thank you very much for all of those. So we'll just jump right in with something that's cropped up on every talk, or the Q&As for the talks, but we haven't actually addressed. So it's maybe a topic for another day as well. But just some quick thoughts from our speakers on the whole topic of order and disorder, and where that may fit into theology. So we've got a question here about radioactive decay. And does God know when an individual atom will undergo radioactive decay? So how do we interpret randomness in quantum mechanics? So that's connected to the order-disorder as well question. Who would like to go first? Just in a kind of like Hunger Games rush to the mic.
Yeah, I'm agnostic on that question. I don't know, because we'd have to know whether that was deterministic or not. And as far as I understand, the physics are still uncertain. It depends whether you accept Copenhagen or not. And so, you know, we just don't know enough about reality to you know, talk. And it's the same with a lot of questions about time. You know, people are quite willing to say, you know, from God's perspective, time looks this way. And I'm going, how in the world did you get a God's perspective on this? That's fascinating. Can I share that? So, you know, for a lot of those questions, I just say, we actually don't have enough information. And so answering it would just tell you more about me than about God.
Just on order in general, a point I tried to make and probably wasn't that clear on is often there's kind of this dichotomy between kind of chance processes and law processes. But the point I wanted to make is that law is also contingent. In a sense, God could have chosen different laws. So that's why I'm not too bothered whether something looks like chance-like or law-like process in terms of God's action. It is interesting in the details, but ultimately it doesn't matter that much, that God could use processes that are law-like, and that still involves a choice from God in some sense. So ascribing something to order or law maybe is pushing it back a step, but it is not removing God from the process.
And I guess just to reiterate how I answered a question along these lines in my Q&A as well, I'm quite interested in the way we use words in a scientific context, word like order, and then how the same word in a different context, social context, political context, how those meanings are porous. So, and I think that's really important to bear in mind. So we think of order and laws. In a sense, these are already metaphors taken from the social world and the political world and used in order to interpret the physical world. And I think we just have to be very careful how that works, how that porous interaction between our social world and our physical world works, and think quite carefully about what we label disorder and what, as opposed to diversity. So one of my concern here is coming from a research area I didn't talk about today, which is looking at the theology of neurodiversity. Obviously, neurodiversity itself is a term that's trying to take away the label of disorder and relabel something as a diversity. And I think that's just one example of the ways in which we, the language of law and order, to use the TV show name, is clearly porous and something to bear in mind, I think, in science and theology dialogues, quite a separate issue from the kind of epistemological issue about what does God know that Bethany answered, or the more ontological issue that Zachary's pointing to. I think there's also a kind of social political issue in this language, and all three things in our answers are big and important and different.
So one of the issues that took 20th century science about 70 years to answer is if you just take a whole bunch of microscopic ping pong balls, colloidal particles, spheres all of the same size. You suspend it in a liquid, and you keep increasing the concentration of balls. So what's the fraction of volume that is taken up by the balls? Okay, that's called the volume fraction. It turns out if you increase the volume fraction to just a tad over 50%, or actually a tad under, the random Brownian motion of those balls would drive them to take up a crystalline array. In the 1950s, there was a whole bunch of people, C.N. Yang, the Nobel Prize winner, T.D. Lee was in the room, about 15 theoretical physicists in a room. When they were asked to vote, this is truth by vote, would those balls crystallize spontaneously out of disorderly Brownian motion? The vote was split. Soon after, Ardern and Wainwright did a computer simulation to show that it probably would, but my senior colleague, Peter Pusey, in 1987, did the actual experiment with ping-pong ball-sized colloids, and they crystallized. Is that order? Is that disorder? The second law of thermodynamics, which is a law about disorder, is one of the hardest laws in physics. I have a student who now works in the UK Patent Office. The only patent application you're allowed to bin without further ado are perpetual motion engines because they break the second law. The hardest law in physics is about disorder. Try that. And in the end, going back to hiddenness of God, whose idea of order am I talking about? God keeps using the cross to subvert human wisdom, human ideas of power, of beauty, of order, of all those kinds of things. Whose order are we talking about?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So going from the most difficult question in the universe, the most difficult law, to maybe something a bit simpler for Zachary. I'll just read the question out in its entirety so you know what's going on. So it says, you recognise that for genuine novelty, e.g. new proteins or functions, you can't rely on chance, but need some sort of directed leap or search. One of your quotes referred to tailored algorithms. What might be the nature of these algorithms? Do you think they will be or have to be naturalistic?
I don't think they have to be naturalistic. That would be kind of setting a philosophical condition that I don't think we're justified in setting. But as a scientist, I'm interested in exploring what those mechanisms could be, and that's what I guess a bunch of my papers are about. People can go and read them if they really want. But yeah, so there's a few options here. But so one of them would be that functions are quite easy to come across, and then chance would be a reasonable explanation. If functions are quite hard to come across, which I think there's a bunch of reasons to think that is the case, then either they coming across novelty is very rare, which was the historic position, or the view that I'm proposing is that there are biases that facilitate the origin of novelty. And that's becoming kind of the mainstream position in evolutionary biology. So you can run my kind of argument as a hypothetical. Let's just take it for granted this evolutionary story is true, and there are these kinds of biases. For me, that still raises the deeper question of why are there these kinds of biases, some of which look like they're very fundamental, like the structure of the genetic code. It seems to go back to at least Luca, the last universal common ancestor, the furthest we can trace back. So there are these fundamental biases. Why is that? I think that leaves open the room for some kind of inference to God having set the world up in a particular way. That's the way I prefer to run it. Others might prefer to be interventionist, but I think that raises a whole bunch of other questions that are unhelpful for evolutionary biology, and the evolutionary biology itself doesn't justify. I don't think we need to go there. So I prefer to go the kind of route that I was laying out.
So you were talking about the concept of a fitness landscape. So this is to plot fitness against, say base pairs along your genes or whatever it is. We can draw a one-dimensional graph, and one-dimensional graph only has peaks and valleys. You can possibly have plateaus, but that's it, right? Two-dimensional surface, go to Arthur's seat. There are things called saddle points. Be minimum this way, maximum this way, like a saddle. It turns out that in the next dimension up, which no one knows how to draw, all you have to do is go to 4 dimensions. In 4 and higher dimensions, the most favorite things are gutters. Things that runs from one to the other really fast. And the fitness landscape that you're talking about is multidimensional, because each axis is basically ATCG possibility on each of your genes. That really high dimensional landscapes, one of the most frequently occurring things, I learned this from my erstwhile friend, who's sadly passed away, Tom McLeish, who's a theorist. In the higher dimension space, gutters is the deal. So quite often, our intuition from 1, 2-dimensional graphs don't work. You think there's way over there, but there's an enormous gutter that goes boom, and you're there. So, they're much more subtlety than you think, and only proper theoretical physicists can think gutters in 4-dimensional space. I can't do it.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And this really is kind of the cutting edge of the field, trying to understand these multidimensional fitness landscapes. And talking to people like Peter Jevons, computer scientist, who's an expert in this area, it's not clear to him, like his intuitions don't really give him an answer which way that goes, whether that makes it harder or easier. There's papers arguing in both directions that does put some constraints on evolution, and it also opens up other possibilities. But I think, so my claim, and Peter Jevons' claim, is what we're seeing from computer science is that in order to get these kinds of searches to work, it looks like they need to be quite well tailored, which in itself is not the kind of intuition that someone like Daniel Dennett or Susan Blackmore has, and I think it pushes back against some of their assumptions.
Okay, so just another quick one for Zachary. Really put him to the limits today. So how does your view of divine constraints and bias in evolution differ from intelligent design? That's with a capital I and a capital D.
Yeah, so I mean, this will be controversial, but I really do think I have a real middle way between what is commonly associated with theistic evolution, and which is a very broad camp and it has all kinds of things, but a lot of assumptions that would be typical for theistic evolution would be suspicious of any kind of design inference, whereas intelligent design says in order to make a design inference, you need to show the insufficiency of an evolutionary mechanism. Whereas I think there is a middle way where we accept the sufficiency of an evolutionary mechanism, but that still has an explanatory remainder. Things like the fitness landscape. Why does the fitness landscape have this shape? That's a given for biologists. Biologists can't explain that. That maybe it goes down to physics, but I think ultimately it goes down to just the structure of the universe, the laws of nature and the initial conditions. So in my view, some of these fundamentals of evolution won't be explained by evolutionary biology, and they're just taken as a given by evolutionary biologists. Fully legitimate for that field, but leaves open the question of why the world has this structure, which I would say is more of a philosophical question, which can point in a theological direction. So I really think it is a middle way. You can have a real design inference without needing to reject mainstream evolutionary processes.
Thank you, Zach. So this next question is for Wilson and Zach, but everyone else can join in if they want as well. So what did Wilson and Zachary think of Bethany's talk? Does God act disruptively, imply through miracles? And do you think that impacts science? Let's get a proper discussion going here.
Luckily, I wrote down what I thought of Bethany's talk. There's even a graph here. Yeah, but that was from the last conference. I didn't actually put a graph during Bethany's talk. So the bit that I really liked is this business of when you talk about miracle, the context is important. Miracle is about leading people towards Christ's likeness. Now, what does it mean to be Christ-like? Philippians 2 is the one who humbled himself and took the form of a servant and become obedient unto the point of death. So what that is saying to me is that a miracle can only be discerned, it's not a knockdown proof, can only be discerned by those whose life and beliefs already have what, I think it was Tim Gorringe, you call it the Christic shape. So I think that's what I took from your talk. I'm going to give it to Zach first. I can't read my next line of notes.
Yeah, I'm really open to interventionism, and I completely agree. There's having attended like a divine action conference and looked into it a little bit, but not that much. I don't think there's great arguments against God potentially having intervened. Scientifically, I don't think it matters. And I am interested in these really events that look highly improbable. And for me, it's an interesting question, is that a problem in evolutionary biology? And I think people's intuitions or the literature maybe is unclear on that. Like, let's say the origin of life was a highly improbable event, or eukaryogenesis, or some of these major transitions. Is that a problem for evolutionary theory, or do we just say, okay, some improbable stuff happens, that's fine? I think we have to, at some point, accept there are some improbable events that do occur. And for me, that's definitely a potential locus of divine action. Whether it's interventionist or not, I don't mind too much. But also, I don't feel a need to rely on, and Bethany wasn't saying this at all, but some people do kind of rely on these junction points which look highly improbable for God to act. I don't think that's true, because God acts through law-like processes as well. He sustains the whole universe. But maybe some of these things that look improbable, look unlikely, they could be points where there was an intervention. I'm fully open to that. I just don't mind either way, because God sustains the whole thing anyway.
Yeah, if I can put a little comment. I mean, having said brash interventionistic miracles are back on the menu, I'm also very, very avoidant of saying we don't understand this thing in Earth history, therefore a miracle. And I think the reason for that is, if the purpose of miracles is for it to lead people to Christ-likeness, I see no reason for God to do miracles prior to people, because that's the whole reason they're around. So if there's no discerners to discern God's action, which is being done as a way to bring people to Christ, then I'd be very happy to say the very first miracles in Earth history and in the universe's history, well, the universe may be too big, in Earth's history happened as people got to consciously know God.
Just, it's at least conceivably possible that there wouldn't be people without there having been a miracle at some point. So maybe the origin of life is not possible through normal processes within a given time period. I think that's an open question. Maybe that's really controversial, but I think most scientists would accept that that is an open question in terms of how likely was it. And if it turns out it was incredibly improbable, it's at least possible that God, it seems to me that God did intervene there. Maybe we'll never know either way, but I don't want to rule that out as, I don't see a reason to rule that out.
So now we're going to just swerve entirely onto a completely fresh topic that hopefully our panel will have something to say about. So how do we justify spending resources? This is a very practical question on pure science that may have no direct benefit to humanity. Just throw that one out there to you.
Okay, how do I narrow?
Just a quick, probably others have much more interesting to say on things, but one model for this would be art, for instance, and see aesthetic value. And I see aesthetic value in the work I do. I think theoretical evolutionary biology is really beautiful. Most people probably don't think that, but I think there is a beauty in understanding the fundamental level of how things work. But I think there is something here that it might be harder on a kind of standard secular or naturalistic view of the world to really justify fundamental science if you really knew that there wasn't going to be a practical outcome. Of course, we don't know that. It's so hard to predict this stuff. But some areas are more likely to result in useful practical things than others. And I think, personally, I think this is a bit of a challenge within the modern kind of university system to justify a lot of areas of study that are less easily justifiable in kind of pragmatic utilitarian terms. But as a Christian, definitely the divine mind as the source of everything gives us reason to explore all kinds of things that might be hard to justify on other frameworks.
Yeah, I would I would add that from a Christian perspective, there are loads of good reasons, actually. Like God calls us to know the world and grow in knowledge and love of him in the process. Humans are made for more than utilitarian purposes. They're made for play and creativity, and all those things are good and God-given. That's not to neglect the real needs in the world, obviously. But I also think there's a kind of question as well around, and actually it was Zach's comments on the current university setting that made me think of this, around what counts as a useful outcome, right? So current universities, at the moment, we all have to report on the impact of our research, but it's not at all clear what counts as impact and what doesn't. Typically, if you can measure it, that's really good impact, but obviously there's loads of really important implications for one's work that aren't measurable, or aren't immediately measurable. So there is a bigger question around what counts as having a useful purpose and what doesn't. It's a big question facing not just the sciences, but perhaps even more urgently the humanities, where I live and where we all seem to think, the idea is that nothing we do really has any impact. It doesn't really matter, and we're all just enjoying ourselves talking about things. But I think the humanities, I think theology, I think philosophy is absolutely urgent, is as urgent, if not sometimes more urgent than new scientific discoveries, at least in some ways. But how to measure that and what counts as having a practical outcome is actually a humanities question, right? So,
I'm going to do that thing of making a blanket statement that says all blanket statements are wrong. So I think Christian ethics are always situational. So I don't think you can ever say, oh yes, pure science is always worthwhile when there's a crisis going on, or vice versa, that you should always feed the poor and never do pure science. I think that has to be worked out with each person in light of their situation. And I think given the climate change that we're likely to face, it might become unethical to put time and money towards that as opposed to prolonging and helping lives of people who are in desperate need. Might become unethical. Don't know, maybe it is now, I don't know. But I think that's for each person to discern between themselves, the opportunities they have, how God is calling them, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that's one of the most urgent questions that a Christian scientist, Christian who's working as a scientist, can possibly confront today, and is not discussed nearly enough. Perhaps you should have a conference entirely on it. How does one put this? Most grant applications that I've ever seen, or that I have written, is at best a white lie, the first 3 paragraphs. Because it usually says, I'm doing this because it could be useful in the following ways. And typically has never been useful in any of the following ways, or indeed in any other way. But the funding system somehow forces us to tell those lies to each other, amazingly, just so that the Research Council can go and tell those lies to the government so that we can carry on getting the money. And we'll probably be sacked after this podcast goes out. But it's unsustainable, and we need to think about it. That's one axis. On the other axis, the alternative talk that I could have given today is about playfulness. So in Proverbs 8, verse 30, it says, wisdom speaking, I was like a little child, standing at the side of God, rejoicing, laughing, playing. All those are legitimate translations of that Hebrew term, of his creation. I think I only want to discuss that question when I know what it means to recover the playfulness motivation in doing science. I think a narrative can be made, that would have been the alternative talk, that until we recover the dimension of playfulness in science, we are not ready to discuss that question, or indeed anything else about how much to spend, what we're supposed to be doing, what we're supposed to be doing with it. But I think it is an absolutely urgent question that I think all of us have only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, that point of playfulness reminds me of a book I read a couple of years ago, The Meaning of Creation, whose author I've immediately forgotten. But in there, he has quite a few chapters on kind of like seeing evolution as a game, as play, and as fun for God and for creation as well. So I think that should be a thread that runs through much of our science as well. So following on from that, I would like each panelist to say, what do they think is the most important area of science and faith that's being talked about or should be talked about, but also what area would they most like to have fun with?
Well, I would change the narrative, as I already said, get rid of the and. I would talk about the theology of science, full stop. But if I have to use the and, I would suggest we change to talk about scientists and faith.
Probably most important that's not being talked about, I would say, are population levels on Earth. Not the thing I want to play with. What would I want to play with? I think there's a lot going on in psychology that's really fascinating. So I would say, you know, that's if I was going to play, that would be it.
Yeah, this is a really hard question. If we took a vote, I would have said of the last question about resources and impact, Bethany gave the best answer. I really liked that point about it being contextual. And so my answer to this question would be contextual. And so right now, I think it's fairly undeniable that the most important questions are about the environmental crisis. But that's not because there always would be the most important questions. This is they're really urgent right now. And for the next few decades, at least. Again, like Bethany said, though, I'm not sure that constitutes what I'm feeling playful about. I really don't know about play. That's really hard. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I have to pass on that. I need to rediscover my inner child, Wilson. I clearly... Yeah.
From my view, something that's really important is just for the wider church, recovering a doctrine of creation and kind of integrating that into how they approach various things. One aspect of that is just the value of work and the goodness of work in general. And so science is one example of work, and it has lots of things, but there's a broader thing I think has largely been neglected across a lot of traditions, like what is work valuable, work outside of kind of standard Christian ministry, and why is that? And I think that ties back to a doctrine of creation, and that's going to feed into the environmental crisis, what our duties are to the environment and to each other, and lots of things. But I think, I mean, I'm biased in this, of course, but I think one reason for that disconnect is discomfort with evolution and kind of disconnect from science because of discomfort with evolution, or a superficial engagement with evolution and with the history of Earth and all of these things. So I think if we were to recover a kind of robust doctrine of creation, that'd be really helpful for a bunch of things. In terms of play, I really enjoy my research. I'm really grateful to be able to do it, and I hope to be able to do it I hope government will fund it in future, and I'll be able to do it in future.
I find metaphysics playful. Oh yeah, I thought of something. I also do metaphysics of mind and consciousness, and I don't find that particularly practical, but I find it hugely enjoyable. So.
Yeah, the really playful project I wanted to do, I already have done, which was the Choose Your Own Adventure book on suffering. So you get to, it's like Pilgrim's Progress meets analytical theology. It was great fun.
I mean, can I add an addendum? I'm really looking for a day when we no longer have conferences and meetings on science and religion. Let me tell you why. You don't have special once-a-year conference on singing hymns in church, because that's accepted as part of Christian life and worship. The thing about science and religion is singles out as a special thing only for those sort of people who like that kind of thing. But the climate thing is so important. It is not a science and religion topic. It is the topic that the church should be engaged fully in, and I, as a member of my local church, should be engaged in it using all my gifts, including my gifts as a scientist. What really makes me sad every time I go to science and religion meetings, enjoyable though they are, is that there is a science and religion meeting. Yet again, it's a special interest thing that those kind of people do on the Saturday afternoons. And that is the symptom of a deep, deep disease, that science is not integrated into congregational life in the way that music, arts, and all these other things seem to be.
Yeah, it's similar to a point Mark Harris made here last night about science and religion being used kind of almost as a hook to get people off the responsibility of dealing with these topics or having science integrated into the wider kind of church ministry. So we've got a few minutes just to finish and take any questions, burning questions from the audience. So we'll start with one from online. Tim?
Okay, the first one is, in light of what we understand about the interplay of chance and necessity in evolution, is Homo sapiens the crown of all creation, as Psalms 8 appears to suggest? If not, what then?
Since I get it first, what's your theology of crowning? What's your theology of kingship? What kind of king? Is it a servant king or is it another kind of king?
Ditto.
Yeah, I almost want to say the same. I'm going to give myself a moment more to think.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a normative question, I guess, like what is important, what counts as important, that's not obvious. But I don't want to lose, I don't want to just throw away human uniqueness. So I think there's lots of really interesting things about humans, and that comes with responsibilities to creation and to each other. And there are, I think, in recent years, to some extent, there's been some kind of renewed interest in possibility. I mean, every biologist kind of find it kind of boring that every species is unique in some way, which is true. But of course, humans are unique in some ways that I think are genuinely special. But that is a normative claim about, or a claim about, or a evaluative claim at least about values. And but what one thing, of course, that we see is that we do have certain gifts, and it does come with certain responsibilities, and that is something that ties to our status as humans.
Yeah. Oh, go on.
Okay, yeah. So I think the sort of crowning of creation in that sense is a theological statement, not a scientific one. So I think it means something like we're made in the image of God, and I think that means that God chose us in a sort of election way out of all the creatures, not because we're the fastest, not because we're the strongest, we have pathetic claws, pathetic teeth, there are all sorts of ways that we're not the best, but we have a particular relationship with God that I think is unique in various ways, and I play with Joshua Moritz's idea of election. So when he says the image of God is kind of like the election of Israel amongst the people in the world. It was not because they were the biggest, the most numerous. They weren't. It's something about just divine choice says, okay, I'm going to work with these sets of people for now, and eventually that will be everyone. So I think as far as it goes, it would say humans have this unique relationship with God, and part of our task is to draw every other creature into fellowship with God through that. And so it becomes an ever-expanding circle of that unique relationship of God, so that all of creation is crowned. And so again, then the whole point is to work ourselves out of a job, which goes back to what you said.
Yeah, I ended my first book, which was called Mind in Creation, with the idea that rather than being priests of creation, where we're the intermediaries between creation and God, instead we should maybe reimagine that role, that task of humanity as worship leaders of a creation that's itself worshiping God and itself has a relationship with God in its own way. So we're not so utterly distinct and different in a theological sense. But we clearly do have power in this world that other creatures don't have. We get to determine whether or not species survive, and we're doing a pretty bad job at that. But and that power comes, as Spider-Man says, with great responsibility, to lead other creatures in their worship and to learn from them as they worship God as well. Yeah.
Okay, has anyone else got a really urgent question? Oh, is there another one online, Tim? Yeah.
This one was, I'm unfamiliar with the writings of Amos Young and James K.A. Smith, though I would broadly understand them to be evangelical. Please could you comment on another evangelical who has written specifically about miracles in addition to writing many New Testament commentaries? What is your position in relation to the two individuals you mentioned and the position you were advocating? And then it says, in regards to Craig Kinnear's book, Miracles Today, The Supernatural Work of God and the Modern World.
Just ask Mary if she could just get the door as well.
So I've heard Craig Keener talk at conferences. I haven't read his voluminous books, but essentially, as far as I can tell, what he's saying is something like David Hume's argument is nobody's ever witnessed a miracle. It's always something that happens away somewhere else, and so we can assume that miracles don't happen and they're inventions that become just so stories. And he's saying, actually, we have tons of evidence that miracles seem to happen all the time. So he basically works from that to disable that, Hume's argument. And so in my longer paper that I did write, I do reference him as a good example of why we shouldn't just sort of dismiss miracles outright. So I have sort of skimmed his books, but not read them a whole lot. Amos Young is probably the foremost Pentecostal theologian now that Gordon Fee has died. So I think that he is just, one of the central figures in Pentecostal theology. James K. Smith, who works at Calvin University, he has, like me, Pentecostal roots, and so writes as a Pentecostal some of the time as I do. And has a great book called Desiring the Kingdom that's a part of a number of things. He mostly works on sort of theology and culture stuff. And then there was where I am situated in that. Well, I think my situation is kind of what I said at the beginning, that I'm a charismatic evangelical Anglo-Catholic mess, muddle of particular views. And so I don't... I'm constantly surprised when people sort of tell me what theological position I took, because I often have not known that was what I took myself. And it's similar to sort of when people talk about my field, so Bethany's a systematic theologian. I go, oh, am I? Okay, that's great. Or I'm a historical. So, I'm in science and religion largely because it is a muddle and you can do a little bit of everything. And I feel like denominationally, that's how I approach things as well. So what I will say is I'll look at a Thomist system and say, that's entirely coherent. I love it. I can grab these bits and these parts from that. And then I'll look at a process theology view and go, okay, I love that. That's self-consistent. Those two are mutually exclusive, but I don't know which one is right. So I'm just going to grab pieces from both of them and see if I can do something else in the middle, or just kind of flip inconsistently between the two, depending on the day.
Can I just ask you a question? Yeah. Slightly nerd, but what you just described sounds very much like how McCord Adams describes her methodology in Christ and Horace in chapter 1, her skeptical realism. I mean, is that approximately right? Because the situation is so complex that it really doesn't do to just take one position. You have to kind of grab bits and then state what your basic data is, and I'm going to prioritize that bit. Yeah. It's never going to be totally coherent, but that's how we do science all the time. We deal with complicated stuff. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like the idea of being lost in a world of unlabeled maps. So, I mean, you wake up in an unfamiliar place, you've got a trunk full of maps like you had, and then you're trying to figure out where in the world am I, and so you're piecing things together. So we have people who are like, here's the full map. And you're like, well, there's bits there. So I think that we're all map making and trying to describe this wonderful surprising reality and the surprising presence of God within that in different ways.
Maps are always being updated and refreshed and renewed with new information. So just to say thank you to all of our speakers. We're coming to the close of the day. Thank you for all your talks and for being on this panel, for the answering questions, and for all the chats with all of us throughout the day as well. So if we could just thank all of our speakers.